The new wards were to be known as the Victoria wards. Despite these improvements, a report on the hospital submitted to the governor in December 1888 was very scathing on the organisation and administration of the hospital. Uncleanliness, neglect, and lack of care and method were reported to prevail. Wards, toilets, baths were dirty, and the nurses' rooms were described as indescribably filthy. In many of the drawers were to be found great collections of food, fertile sources of disease and sickness. Dirty linen, dirty rags, and all kinds of accumulation of dirty materials were to be found in the sculleries and in every cupboard. The disinfecting room was never used as such and was in a deplorable state of neglect and disrepair, and the operating theatre had been misappropriated as a female ward. Many other criticisms are to be found in this report. Not surprisingly, following this report, the Governor, Sir Arthur Harding, appointed a special commission to inquire into the administration of the hospital. This commission endorsed the report and recommended that the hospital should become a government institution and be known as the Colonial Hospital, under the management of a governing body presided by His Excellency the Governor. This recommendation was adopted, and so the civil hospital became the Colonial Hospital in 1889. In 1902, a new wing was added, comprising a ward and sisters' quarters. On the 19th of November 1921, His Excellency the Governor-General Sir Horace Lockwood Smith-Dorrien opened a new extension to the outpatients department and maternity ward at a cost of £4,000. X-ray apparatus cost a further £1,000. The money was donated by the British Red Cross in recognition of the support given to it by the inhabitants of Gibraltar during the Great War. In 1924, a lift was presented to the hospital by John Mackintosh. On the 31st of December 1932, the Governor, Sir Alexander Godley, officially opened an extension to what had been known as Mackinnon's Ward, where the female patients were housed. The new ward was named the Godley Ward. The name was changed to St. Bernard's Hospital in 1963, when colonial suddenly became a dirty word. Today, the hospital no longer occupies semi-isolated position of its early days, and there are those who believe that it should be moved to a less congested area of Gibraltar. As for ourselves, we shall move on to the Moorish castle next week, en route to the Upper Rock. What people tend to refer to as the Moorish Castle is without doubt one of the outstanding landmarks of Gibraltar. However, what is not always realized is that that tower is but a part of what was a much larger complex stretching all the way down to Grand Casement Square. Some of the castle walls still survive today, so let's go and have a look at them. On the 27th of February 1845, work began in clearing up and repairing the southwest tower of the castle for the reception of a clock, which was inaugurated on the 4th of December of that year. Garrison orders announced the event as follows. On Thursday at midday, the clock in Stanley's Tower will commence striking and in future regulate garrison time. A third dial plate will be put up as soon as it can be got from England to afford Casement Barracks and Landport the benefit of a direct view. When the clock is striking 12 tomorrow, the Royal Standard will be hoisted on the tower, and after the clock has struck, a royal salute of 21 guns from a battery near the castle will be fired on the occasion of this useful boon to the community having been granted by Her Majesty's favour. We are now looking at a section of the Moorish wall which once formed part of the Moorish castle. The original castle is believed to date back to the second half of the 12th century, but a great deal of reconstruction had to be carried out in the early 14th century due to the damage caused by the almost constant warfare between Spaniards and Moors. This wall almost certainly dates from this latter period. As we skirt this wall heading for the Tower of Homage, we come to this extraordinary construction with a cupola roof. This is the tower of the south gateway of the castle. And here we see what it looked like 150 years ago. The British converted it into ordnance store buildings. We have now reached a section of the wall further up the slope. Considering they were built some 650 years ago, they are in remarkably good condition. These walls were made mainly of tapir, a cement moulded in frames, and then plastered over with a much finer cement. We are now looking at the inner keep of the castle, in front of the Tower of Homage. This leads into a gloomy and forbidding spot. The old cells, long since out of use, where errant soldiers were locked up. As you can see, the space inside was very restricted, and light and ventilation were kept to a minimum. Here we see where a prisoner has tried to keep track of time by scratching the days into the wall. In this room there would be a tub filled with lime, into which the bodies of those executed were thrown prior to burial nearby. On this spot once stood the gallows. The condemned man was placed in a cell behind that wall 24 hours before the appointed time for execution. From the door of that room to the gallows was a matter of 11 paces. And here we have a noose. Because hanged men could not be buried in consecrated ground, they were sometimes buried in this wall. Here we have two plaques recording where two soldiers were so buried. Note that no name appears on the inscription, merely the name of the regiment, the soldier's number, and the date of execution. We are now on the ramparts at the top of the inner keep, and the views from here are truly magnificent. The Moors certainly chose an ideal spot for their castle. Just look at this. We also get a good view of the Tower of Homage from here. When the Moors recaptured Gibraltar from the Spaniards in 1333, they rebuilt an earlier tower, which had been ruined in the fighting, into this structure, which is a solid mass of masonry. The tower withstood 10 sieges, and artillery fire could make little impression on it. Today, one can see the battle scars of those sieges. Here, a Spanish governor held out for 5 months in 1467, after being driven first from the town and then from the rest of the castle by the Duke of Medina Sidonia, who was trying to take Gibraltar from his own sovereign, Isabel la Católica. In 1540, hundreds of people found safety inside the castle when Turkish pirates attacked Gibraltar. Well, it's time to move on once again. Next week we shall head up the rock towards the series of Willis's batteries, and from there to the upper galleries. We have now come to a series of batteries dating back to the early 1730s. The first of these, Princess Caroline's Battery, is named after the wife of King George II and was formerly known as Willis's 1. Completed in 1732, it is situated at the junction of Willis's Road and the road leading to Princess Anne's Battery. Incidentally, Willis was the name of an officer who manned these batteries in 1704-5. This battery was first used in the siege of 1727, and the site was originally a Spanish work. Major reconstruction took place between 1877 and 1879, and it was finally dismantled in 1955. Princess Amelia's battery was also part of the Willis's complex and was formerly known as Willis's II. It too was completed in 1732 and was named after a daughter of George II. Here we have a drawing of Princess Amelia's battery during the Great Siege, done by Lieutenant Curler of the Royal Artillery. We finally come to the third of the Willis's complex, Princess Anne's battery, also completed in 1732 and also named after a daughter of George II. On the 11th of June 1782, during the Great Siege, an enemy shell pierced the magazine door and caused such an explosion that the whole rock shook. A drummer and 13 rank and file were killed, and 3 drummers, 3 sergeants and 9 rank and file were wounded. We have now arrived at one of Gibraltar's touristic high spots, that great engineering feat known as the Upper Galleries, which have their origin in the siege of 1779-1783. During the siege of 1727, the Spaniards had been in the process of constructing a mine under the north face of the rock to blow up Willis's batteries. Peace came before that work could be completed, and it was then dismantled. By 1782, the enemy forces had come so close to the rock that none of the existing batteries in Gibraltar could fire down on them. The governor, General Elliot, anxious to prevent the enemy from recommencing work on the Willis's mine, then offered a reward for suggestions as to how flanking fire might be brought to bear on the northern face of the rock. One idea was to mount guns on top of a projection in the rock face, known as the notch. The problem was how to move the guns up there. Sergeant Ince of the Corps of Military Artificers suggested boring a tunnel through the rock. The idea was approved and work began on the 25th of May, 1782, under the instructions of Ince and the supervision of Lieutenant John Evely, Royal Engineers, ADC to the governor. One must remember that the miners entrusted with this task had no mechanized equipment to help them. They had to rely on their physical strength, sledgehammers and crowbars, with gunpowder for the blasting operations. Work was inevitably slow and laborious. After 5 weeks, the party of 13 men had hewn out a tunnel 82 feet long and 8 feet square into the rock. As the work progressed, the fumes from the blasting almost suffocated the miners. In mid-July, 2 months after the start of the work, it was decided to open a vent to let air into the tunnel. It was only then realized that a gun could be mounted on the embrasure thus created. The inner part of the opening was enlarged to allow for the gun's recoil, and a 24-pounder was mounted. By mid-August, the tunnel was 165 feet long, and 2 more embrasures had been made, into which 24-pounders were mounted. By the time the siege was raised, the tunnel was 370 feet long, had 6 embrasures and 4 guns mounted in it. This first gallery was named the Windsor Gallery. Work did not stop with the ending of hostilities, and by June 1783, the gallery was over 600 feet long and almost at the notch. When walking through the galleries, it can be seen how, whenever possible, the miners followed the natural fissures of the rock. After the 5th opening, it is also evident that a mistake in the direction was made, and the workers found themselves boring towards the face of the rock. What appears to be a second attempt just after the 4th embrasure seems to have been abandoned because they were going too far in. In the latter stages, the tunnel was driven downwards and a large chamber was opened under the notch, called St. George's Hall. There, a battery of 7 guns was installed. Notice the air hole cut through the roof. This communicates with the top of the notch, and access to the latter was by means of a staircase. It is likely that the air hole was used for voice control of the battery from above. In 1878, a banquet was given in St. George's Hall by the governor, Lord Napier of Magdala, to General Grant of the United States of America in honor of his visit to the fortress. These magnificent views give some idea of how these galleries dominated the adjacent country. It's time now to leave this extraordinary place. If you have never visited these galleries before, make sure you do so in the not-too-distant future. Next week, we shall move on to something completely different, the history of Gibraltar's water supply. The construction of the dockyard at the turn of the century was by no means the only project which brought about dramatic changes to the appearance of certain parts of Gibraltar. One now takes very much for granted the picture postcard view of the eastern slopes with the water catchments a prominent feature. Yet these, together with the huge reservoirs inside the rock, date from more or less the same period as the dockworks. But let us go back to the beginning. As far as we know, the first water supply system on the rock dates back to the Moorish occupation. A well or reservoir identified with that period is a so-called Nun's Well near Europa Point, which consisted of an underground arched chamber into which water drained. However, the Moors' most significant contribution in this respect was the construction of an aqueduct, which led water from wells in the South Barracks area via pipes through the town as far as what is today Waterport, where it supplied the galleys. Access to this aqueduct was by means of a number of shafts or vents at intervals, such as this one. The Tower of Homage at the Moorish castle also incorporated a shaft-like reservoir, into which rainwater from the roof was channeled for storage and use. A more modern aqueduct was constructed during the Spanish occupation. After the capture of Gibraltar by the British in 1704, there was no public water supply as such. The military looked after their needs as best they could, and the civil population fended for themselves using the old Spanish aqueduct and fountain. As the population and the strength of the garrison increased, sheer necessity dictated that underground tanks collecting rainwater from roofs should be incorporated in the construction of barracks and dwellings. The problem became acute when many of the private wells were closed down in an effort to stem the spread of cholera, and the use of the Spanish aqueduct was discontinued for public health reasons. In 1863, a parliamentary commission on barrack and hospital improvement inquired into the sanitary conditions and improvements of Mediterranean stations. In evidence given to the commission, the garrison quartermaster observed, "The inhabitants of Gibraltar owe nothing to the British government for the small supply of water they have had for 150 years. The commission reported that there wasn't a single water pipe in the town apart from the old aqueduct, and they made proposals for the preparation of an area of rock above the Moorish castle as a catchment area for rainwater. The vegetation was stripped and the rock rendered impervious by filling in cracks with a cement sand mortar. To store the water, a reservoir of 1.25 million gallon capacity was constructed of masonry and concrete. In 1865, the sanitary commissioners of Gibraltar were set up, and one of their tasks was to lay on a piped water supply for the inhabitants. Important developments came 4 years later, in 1869. The sanitary commissioners' new waterworks were inaugurated. A public health ordinance made it mandatory for all new dwellings to have underground tanks, and groundwater exploration was initiated by Mr. E. Roberts, engineer to the sanitary commissioners. This last revealed a sandy aquifer at the north front. Wells were constructed and the pump house and pumping system built to convey this water to public reservoirs at the Moorish Castle and Europa Road areas. This map shows us the siting of some of these wells. The beginnings of the waterworks, as we know them today, took place between 1898 and 1900. During this period, 4 reservoirs with a total capacity of 5 million gallons were excavated from the west side of the rock at an elevation of 340 feet above sea level. These were declared open by the governor on the 21st of January 1901 and attracted much interest. These reservoirs were fed with water collected from a rocky area on the northwest slopes of the rock, which had been cleared of its natural vegetation and all crevices filled with concrete. The water was conveyed through open channels and pipes into the reservoirs. The continuing increase in demand led to further schemes, and in particular the construction of a catchment area of 10 acres on the east side of the rock. Here we have a view of the eastern slopes before the catchment areas went up. And another view. This work began in 1903 and entailed the removal by blasting of big boulders to make the surface as even as possible. At the lower perimeter of the catchment area, where we are now, a channel and footpath were also constructed. We shall continue with the history of Gibraltar's water supply next week before descending from here to the village of Catalan Bay. To the village of Catalan Bay. We continue today with the history of Gibraltar's water supply. Between 1911 and 1914, a 5th reservoir of 2 million gallon capacity was excavated from the rock, and the catchment area was extended by a further 14 acres. On the 6th of March 1917, as the result of a severe southwest gale, which reached hurricane force, accompanied by abnormal rainfall, a large piece of rock was loosened on the eastern slopes and fell on the collecting area, tearing up several corrugated iron sheetings, which allowed the water to infiltrate into the sand and caused a great deal of damage to the houses in Catalan Bay village. Fortunately, no one was killed. In 1928, a 6th reservoir capable of holding 1 million gallons was added to the system. Each reservoir was connected to the main channel by means of large diameter pipes with valves to control the entry of water into them. They were also connected to the pumping mains conveying water from other sources. Between 1928 and 1945, 4 further reservoirs were excavated, adding a further 4 million gallons storage capacity. This reservoir, number 10, had been excavated but not completed when the Second World War broke out. A barracks was then built inside it to house a detachment of the Black Watch under bomb-proof conditions. The last 2 reservoirs, numbers 11 and 12, were constructed between 1958 and 1961 at a lower level, reached from the east side opposite Catalan Bay. These were constructed to receive rainwater from a further extension of 10 acres of catchment at a lower level on the east side slopes. The total capacity of these 12 reservoirs and the Moorish Castle Reservoir raised the total storage capacity to about 16 million gallons. Here we have a schematic diagram showing the whole arrangement. Note the siting of the reservoirs and the natural fissure in the rock, which is used for water overflow. However, the water catchments are by no means the only source of water supply in Gibraltar. In fact, they tell me that only about 6% of the water consumed here comes from these catchments. Some of the corrugated sheeting is in very poor condition, and it would probably be uneconomical to repair. So, may we soon be seeing the end of this marvelous engineering feat? Most of our drinking water today comes, of course, from distillation. Let's go down to Catalan Bay. The village of Catalan Bay has stood here from time immemorial. From the beginning of the British occupation and probably even before that, the village was inhabited by fishermen, almost all of whom were natives of Genoa. The name Catalan Bay, however, only dates back to around 1745. Before that, the area was referred to as the Back of the Rock and not under any specific name. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the village came directly under the authority of the War Department. As you can see from this map, there was a barracks there and a military officer was in charge of police duties. No one could live in the village without a special permit from the governor, and these were not easy to come by. The administration of Catalan Bay was not transferred to the colonial government until October 1930. Situated as it is at the foot of steep slopes, the village and the road leading to it are periodically subject to landslides. During the Peninsular War, French forces had advanced as far south as San Roque, and some of the inhabitants of that place had taken refuge at Catalan Bay. On the 10th of December 1811, a huge boulder, probably loosened by recent rains, detached itself from the rock above the village and came tumbling down towards the sea. In the process, it crushed 4 sheds, killed 18 of the Spaniards and wounded another 18. On another occasion, in February 1870, a landslip cut off the village from land communication with the rest of Gibraltar for nearly a month. The Roman Catholic chapel of St. Mary is one of the focal points in the village. A small chapel existed here during the early years of the British occupation, capable of holding between 60 and 70 persons. In the 1850s, a new chapel was built capable of holding 150 persons. It also contained a room which was used as a school for 20 to 30 scholars. This new chapel was first used in 1857. It was first referred to as St. Mary's Chapel in 1863. In the great floods of November 1875, the chapel was completely gutted by the torrent of sand and stones washed from the rocks above. Fortunately, there were no casualties. A word, finally, about the name Catalan Bay. The once held belief that the name derives from the fact that Catalans once lived there can now be discarded. Although some Catalans took part in the attack of 1704, there is no evidence that any of them lived in this village. The most likely explanation for the name is that it was due to a confusion in the minds of the British between the Genoese and the Catalans. Both played an active part in defending Gibraltar, both used to wear a peculiar red cap, both were foreign to the British garrison, both followed the pursuit of fishing. This confusion, added to the fact that they would hear the place spoken of as a caleta, the Spanish word for a small bay, could account for the name Catalan Bay. In the next program, the penultimate in this series, we shall return to the Upper Rock to do the tourist bit, St. Michael's Cave and the apes.